Hi, everyone. Welcome to Vlog Sunday. I'm going to talk to you today about my top 10 favorite historical films of the 1930s. The 1930s and the first half of the 1940s were a really good age for historical dramas. We don't see those as much anymore. Enthusiasm for, quote, period films is on the wane a little bit. I wonder if perhaps part of the hunger that 1930s audiences felt for costume dramas, for these kinds of films, may have sprung from just how quickly the aesthetic of the world they knew was changing. At the beginning of the century, you had ladies in corsets with parasols, very long skirts, very thick wool clothing. And then by the 1930s, well, you'd come through the 1920s when skirts were raised, ankles were clearly visible, um, you could catch glimpses of knees even. And then in the 1930s, some of the fashions of the early 30s, you got back to that ankle length skirt business, but the genie was already out of the bottle, so to speak. But you had people, I mean, this was only 30 years later, and you had people who remembered what the knickerbockers and the caps and the top hats and the long skirts were like. They'd lived with them, they'd seen them. And so there was a little bit of nostalgia for earlier time periods, so you got a lot of these kinds of films. Some of them were not all that great, but I do have some favorites. The first few are not really ranked in terms of I like this one 10th, I like this one ninth. When we get toward the top, when we get particularly to the top four, then there's a more definite ranking. So, want to start off by talking about my number 10 choice, a 1930 film called The Tower of London, starring Basil Rathbone, Boris Karloff. Basil Rathbone plays Richard III, and Boris Karloff plays Mord, his executioner. And this is a depiction of the late War of the Roses, where you had the royal family basically living in the towers. So the place where the royal family lived and the community of their servants and ladies in waiting, that community was right beside the world of crime and punishment, where if you spoke too harshly about a member of the royal family, that could get you sent to the chopping block. So, Richard III is not only interested in eliminating all the enemies and rivals of his ruling family, he's also interested in getting rid of all the members of that ruling family so that he can take over, of course. And Boris Karloff is his loyal henchman, and together they make a very fascinating villainous pair. It is an interesting look at the way that 1930s filmmakers saw the late Middle Ages. You also get Vincent Price in a rather small role, not being very Vincent Price like because he's kind of a wimp in this. He plays the Duke of Clarence, who ends up being drowned in a vat of wine by Richard. And he's kind of useless. So he doesn't have that energy and dark charm that Vincent Price would later bring to his best performances. But still, he's there, and it's interesting seeing him work alongside Basil Rathbone and Boris Karloff when he would later work with them again in the 1950s and 1960s. He'd share space with them on screen in, well, sharing this. Vincent Price would share the screen with Rathbone in a movie called oh darn it, now I'm blanking on, Tales of Terror. Tales of Terror, which is an anthology directed by Roger Corman, based on 3 Edgar Allan Poe tales. And he'd work with Karloff in 2 movies. One, The Raven in 1963, and then The Comedy of Terrors. So, very interesting to look at the first time these 3 actors met on screen. And it really is just a fun movie looking at the diabolical plotting and also seeing the. You don't really think of the Tower of London as being a community, a place where not only royal but regular people lived and worked. And this shows you this. So at number 9, and these last 2, again, the early items on this list are pretty much interchangeable. But a movie I also like, Juarez, starring Paul Muni and Brian Aherne. This is an interesting movie. Well, it is set in a period that really has not gotten a lot of attention from Hollywood. This is one of the few depictions you get of the not the Mexican Revolution, not the what happened in the early years of the 20th century, but the overthrow of European rule in Mexico that happened in the 1860s, where you had Emperor Maximilian of Austria assigned to be a kind of king of Mexico, and his wife Carlotta, who is played by Bette Davis. So Brian Aherne and Bette Davis play the ruling European couple. And what makes this film interesting to me is that this ruling European couple is actually depicted in a very sympathetic light. You actually like Maximilian. You're touched by his relationship with his wife. You can't help admiring the guy. And at the same time, you know that he is destined to lose this battle. He's not going to come out on top. And then you have Paul Muni playing Benito Juarez, who is very stoic. He comes across as extremely noble, extremely heroic, perhaps not as human as Maximilian does, because you don't get any scenes of his personal relationships with his wife or with children or anything like that, which you do with Maximilian. So it's an interesting look at 2 personalities, 2 individuals in conflict, despite the fact that they actually have quite a bit in common. So this is a situation where you're rooting for people on both sides, and you know that they can't both win. So it's interesting to see how this plays out. And like Robin Hood, Juarez also boasts one of those wonderful, rousing Erich Wolfgang Korngold scores. Don't ignore the music in these 1930s films that I'm going to be talking about. You have a lot of composers doing some of their best work for film. At number 8, I have another Paul Muni film, The Life of Emile Zola, for which he won an Oscar. And this movie actually focuses less on the entire life of Emile Zola than it does on specifically his involvement in the Alfred Dreyfus affair. For those of you who don't know, Alfred Dreyfus was a French soldier who was accused of treason and sent to Devil's Island, basically sent to hell on earth, when the General High Command basically framed this guy and othered him, exploited him. He was Jewish. Alfred Dreyfus was Jewish, but the movie doesn't really go into that except for one. You do get a screenshot of Alfred Dreyfus's file as they look for someone to blame for an information leak. And the picture gives you his name, his rank, and then it says religion Jew. That's the only mention of Dreyfus's Jewishness that this 1937 film makes. Evidently, they weren't quite ready to go into the role that anti-Semitism played in the mistreatment of Alfred Dreyfus. But Paul Mooney is very good in this film, and equally good and winning a Best Supporting Actor Oscar for the movie is Joseph Schildkraut, who played Alfred Dreyfus. Schildkraut often got cast as villains in movies like Marie Antoinette and then later in 1940 in The Shop Around the Corner. But here he gives a very powerful, sympathetic performance as this victim of the corrupt upper military echelon. So after that, one interesting thing that studios did at the time was make movies about early 20th century time periods without really being accurate to the costumes or the music. But Warner Brothers made a movie called The Roaring Twenties, which casts James Cagney as a charismatic and sympathetic bootlegger. Because by the end of the 1930s, everybody in America knew what a really bad mistake Prohibition had been in the first place. And so this is the more sympathetic view of the gangster type that Cagney was already famous for playing. Humphrey Bogart is in it as well, playing his enemy, his rival. And it's interesting to look at the way that the movie moves through the different years of the 1920s, looking back on a very noteworthy period of recent history. So that's all I've got time to talk with you about for this particular video. We will pick up with my number 6 choice in just a few minutes.